The quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac of Maplewood Drive was the last place anyone would expect to uncover a scandal. Known for its neatly trimmed lawns and bake sale fundraisers, the neighborhood seemed idyllic, until strange noises began echoing from Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's basement late at night. At first, the elderly woman's neighbors chalked it up to her vintage TV or maybe a new hobby. But as the thuds, cheers, and muffled shouts grew louder, the neighborhood watch decided to investigate. What they found left them speechless. Mrs. Whitmore, the sweet 82-year-old grandma who baked cookies for the block, was running an underground fight club. The first to notice something strange was Tom Peterson, the self-appointed head of the neighborhood watch. He lived directly across from Mrs. Whitmore and often prided himself on knowing everyone's business. Late one Tuesday night, as he was locking up, he heard it, a series of loud thuds followed by muffled cheering. He paused, his hand on the latch, straining to listen. It sounded like a boxing match, but that couldn't be right. Mrs. Whitmore was 82, for crying out loud. Surely she wasn't hosting late-night brawls. The next morning, Tom brought it up at the weekly watch meeting, held in the community center. "Has anyone else heard strange noises coming from Eleanor's place at night?" he asked, glancing around the table. A few eyebrows raised, but most shrugged. "I thought it was just her TV," said Sandra, a retiree who lived 2 doors down. "She watches those old action movies. Maybe she's fallen asleep with it on." Tom shook his head. "This was different. I heard cheers, like a crowd." The group chuckled. "Maybe she's hosting poker nights," suggested Phil, who had a reputation for being overly suspicious. "Or bingo." But as the days passed, the noises grew louder and more frequent. It wasn't just the occasional thud or shout, it was full-blown commotion. On Friday night, Carol Martin, who lived next door to Mrs. Whitmore, called Tom in a panic. "It's happening again," she whispered over the phone. "There's yelling, and I swear I just heard someone say, 'Round 2.'" Tom decided enough was enough. He gathered a small group of watch members, Carol, Phil, and Sandra, and they took positions around Mrs. Whitmore's house that night. Armed with flashlights and notebooks, they crouched in the shadows, waiting. At first, all was quiet. The lights in Mrs. Whitmore's home flickered warmly, and the faint scent of cookies wafted from the kitchen window. But just as they began to wonder if they'd imagined it all, the sounds began. Heavy footsteps, muffled voices, and then a distinct chant, "Fight! Fight! Fight!" Phil nearly dropped his flashlight. "What the—" he started, but Tom motioned for silence. They crept closer, careful to stay hidden in the bushes. Peering through the basement window, Tom's jaw dropped. Inside, a makeshift arena had been set up, complete with ropes, a referee, and a small but enthusiastic crowd. In the center of the room, 2 men were squaring off, their fists raised. And there, standing at the edge of the ring, was Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore herself, clipboard in hand, yelling, "Keep your guard up, Jimmy. You're dropping your left." Sandra gasped audibly, and Carol clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Eleanor, sweet, cookie-baking Eleanor." Tom didn't respond. He was too busy fumbling for his phone to snap a picture. But as the group watched in stunned silence, they realized something even stranger. The fighters weren't the burly, tattooed types you'd expect in a fight club. One was the young mailman who worked their route, and the other was an out-of-shape accountant who lived 3 streets over. "What is this?" Phil muttered. "Some kind of suburban fight club?" Tom shook his head, his voice low. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." The neighborhood watch reconvened the next morning at Carol's house, the living room buzzing with disbelief. Carol paced back and forth, clutching a mug of coffee as though it were a lifeline. "I still can't believe what we saw," she said, her voice trembling. "Sweet Eleanor, running a fight club in her basement? How does that even happen?" Phil leaned back on the couch, arms crossed. "She's not as innocent as she looks. I've always said there was something off about her." "Yeah, sure, Phil," Sandra said with a roll of her eyes, "because an 82-year-old woman baking cookies and knitting scarves screams criminal mastermind. Tom raised a hand to silence them. "We need to stay focused. This is more than just strange. It could be illegal. If there's money involved, betting, or someone gets seriously hurt, we're talking real consequences." "What do you suggest we do?" Carol asked, sitting down at last. "Call the cops?" Tom shook his head. "Not yet. We need more evidence. Right now, all we have is what we saw through a window. If we're wrong, we risk tarnishing Eleanor's reputation for no reason." The group nodded in reluctant agreement. "So, what's the plan?" Phil asked. "We set a trap," Tom said simply. "Tonight we'll take shifts watching her house. We'll document everyone who goes in and out, and if we get a chance, we'll find a way to gather concrete proof. Photos, videos, something undeniable." Sandra frowned. "And what if she catches us snooping?" "We'll deal with that if it happens," Tom replied, though he didn't sound entirely confident. That night, the group split into pairs, each taking a 2-hour shift to watch Mrs. Whitmore's house from different angles. Carol and Sandra took the first shift, stationed in Sandra's car parked a few houses down. The street was quiet, the glow of porch lights and the occasional chirp of crickets adding to the eerie calm. For the first hour, nothing happened. Carol was beginning to think they'd imagined the whole thing when a figure emerged from the shadows and knocked on Mrs. Whitmore's side door. The door opened, and the figure slipped inside. "Did you see that?" Carol whispered, nudging Sandra. "Got it," Sandra replied, raising a pair of binoculars. "Looks like the guy who delivers pizza around here." "What's he doing going into her basement?" Carol asked, her voice laced with suspicion. As their shift ended, Tom and Phil took over, moving to a position near the back of the house. Over the next hour, they saw 2 more people arrive, a middle-aged woman carrying what looked like a duffel bag and a young man with taped fists. "This is definitely more than a book club," Phil muttered. The real breakthrough came during the final shift, when Tom managed to record a video through a gap in the basement curtains. The grainy footage showed a small crowd gathered around a makeshift ring, cheering as 2 men exchanged blows. In the background, Mrs. Whitmore stood on a stool, clapping enthusiastically and shouting, "Let's hear it for our fighters, folks!" By dawn, the group had compiled a list of attendees and several minutes of footage. They met back at Tom's house, bleary-eyed but exhilarated. "This is it," Tom said, holding up his phone. "Proof." "What do we do now?" Sandra asked. Tom hesitated. "We have 2 options. We either confront Eleanor directly and ask her to explain herself, or we take this to the authorities." Carol shook her head. "Confront her? Are you kidding? She might be a criminal." "She's still our neighbor," Sandra pointed out. "We owe her a chance to explain." Phil snorted. "She can explain it to the cops." The group argued for several minutes before finally agreeing to confront Mrs. Whitmore first. "We'll give her a chance to come clean," Tom said. "But if she refuses or things get out of hand, we'll go to the authorities. Deal?" Reluctantly, everyone nodded. The trap was set. Now, all that remained was to see how the sweet grandma of Maplewood Drive would respond when her secret was exposed. The group approached Mrs. Whitmore's house the following evening with a mixture of dread and determination. Tom led the way, clutching the grainy footage on his phone like a smoking gun. Sandra trailed close behind, wringing her hands nervously while Phil's expression hardened with every step. Carol, the most reluctant of them all, whispered, "Are we really doing this? What if we're wrong?" "We're not," Tom replied firmly. "You saw the footage. We just need answers." Tom knocked on the door, his heart pounding. It wasn't long before Mrs. Whitmore appeared, a warm smile on her face and a plate of cookies in hand. "Why, hello, everyone," she greeted cheerfully. "What brings you by? Neighborhood watch business?" Her tone was so disarmingly sweet that for a moment Tom faltered. Yes, sort of. Can we come in?" Mrs. Whitmore's smile faltered slightly, but she stepped aside. "Of course. Come on in. Don't mind the mess. I've been reorganizing my sewing supplies." The group filed into her cozy living room. their eyes darting around for any signs of the activities they'd witnessed the night before. The air smelled faintly of lavender and freshly baked cookies, an aroma so innocent it made the situation feel even more surreal. "So, what's this about?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, settling into her favorite armchair. "Is someone causing trouble?" Tom exchanged a glance with the others before clearing his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've noticed some unusual activity coming from your house at night, and we've seen people coming and going at odd hours." Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh? Is that what this is about? Well, I suppose I do have some late-night visitors now and then, but I assure you, it's nothing untoward." Phil crossed his arms. "We know about the fight club, Eleanor." The room fell silent. Mrs. Whitmore froze for a split second, then burst into laughter. "Fight club? Oh my stars, what on earth are you talking about?" Tom pulled out his phone and played the video. As the grainy footage of the basement ring filled the screen, Mrs. Whitmore's smile vanished. Her eyes flicked between the group and the phone, and for the first time, her sweet demeanor cracked. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I suppose the cat's out of the bag." Sandra gasped. "So it's true. You're running a fight club." Mrs. Whitmore sighed, setting the plate of cookies on the coffee table. "It's not what it looks like," she began. "I'm not running some illegal operation. This is community building." Phil scoffed. "Community building? You've got people beating each other up in your basement." "They're not beating each other up," Mrs. Whitmore said defensively. "They're sparring, training. Some of them needed a way to blow off steam, and others were looking to make a little extra money. I just provided the space." "Why?" Carol asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Why would you even think of doing something like this?" Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward, her eyes serious. "Do you know how many people in this neighborhood are struggling? Jimmy, the mailman. He's been drowning in debt trying to take care of his sick mother. And Lydia, the single mom who lives on Birch Street. She joined to earn enough money to fix her car so she can keep her job. This isn't about violence. It's about helping people." Tom frowned. "And the betting? We saw people placing bets." Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. "I might have allowed a little wagering to make things more interesting. But it's all friendly, nothing out of control." Phil shook his head. "This is insane. You're putting people at risk. What happens if someone gets hurt? Or if the authorities find out?" Mrs. Whitmore squared her shoulders. "I've taken precautions. Everyone signs a waiver, and I've got a first aid kit downstairs. Besides, it's not like I'm forcing anyone to participate. They come of their own free will." Sandra's voice was soft but firm. "Eleanor, this isn't just about waivers. You're running an underground fight club in your basement. If the wrong person finds out, this could blow up in all of our faces." Mrs. Whitmore looked down at her hands, her expression a mix of defiance and guilt. "I didn't mean for it to get this big," she admitted. "It started as a small group, just a few neighbors helping each other out, but word spread and, well, here we are." The group sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation. Finally, Tom spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore, you need to shut it down. Tonight, before this gets out of hand." Her gaze hardened. "I'll think about it," she said. "But I'm not making any promises. These people depend on me." Phil started to protest, but Tom raised a hand. "Let's go. We've said our piece." As they left Mrs. Whitmore's house, the group was more conflicted than ever. What had started as a simple investigation had turned into a moral dilemma, and no one was sure what to do next. The neighborhood watch regrouped at Tom's house the next day, and the tension in the room was palpable. No one could stop replaying Mrs. Whitmore's explanation. A fight club meant to help the community. It seemed absurd, yet somehow it also felt genuine. Tom paced back and forth, clutching a cup of coffee. "We can't ignore what we saw." She admitted to running it. "What if someone gets hurt? What if someone reports this and the whole neighborhood gets dragged into the mess? Sandra shook her head. I don't think she meant any harm, Tom. You saw how she talked about it. It's not like she's doing this for profit or power. Phil scoffed. Oh, come on. You think she's doing this out of the goodness of her heart? She's running a full-blown underground fight club and she didn't even deny it. Carol hesitated before speaking. But what if she's telling the truth? What if people really do depend on her? She's not forcing anyone to fight. Tom sighed. That's the problem. It's not about whether she's forcing people. It's about the risks. This could blow up in her face and ours. The group sat in silence, each lost in thought. Finally, Sandra broke it. What if we talk to some of the fighters? Maybe they can give us a better idea of what's really going on. Tom nodded. That's a start. Let's split up and talk to the people we saw going in and out of her house. Maybe then we can decide what to do. Over the next 2 days, the Neighborhood Watch began their quiet investigation. Carol approached Jimmy the mailman during his route. At first, he seemed nervous, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Look, he said, lowering his voice. I know it sounds crazy, but Mrs. Whitmore's fight club has been a lifesaver for me. My mom's medical bills are piling up, and the little extra I make from sparring has helped me keep us afloat. Sandra spoke with Lydia, the single mom, at the grocery store. Lydia was hesitant to talk at first, but eventually admitted that the fight club had given her a sense of empowerment. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to step into a ring, she said with a wry smile. But Eleanor, she believed in me. She's been like a coach, and honestly, it's been a way to let off steam and make some extra cash. Phil, determined to find dirt, cornered one of the younger fighters, a college student named Marcus. Marcus, however, surprised him. I joined because I needed to pay for textbooks, he said. But honestly, it's more than that. It's a community. Mrs. Whitmore doesn't just run the fights, she looks out for us. She's even helped me study for exams. As the group reconvened, their findings painted a complicated picture. Everyone they spoke to echoed the same sentiment. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just running a fight club, she was providing a lifeline for people who felt like they had nowhere else to turn. That evening, Tom decided to visit Mrs. Whitmore alone. When she opened the door, her expression was guarded, but she stepped aside to let him in. Here to scold me some more? She asked with a raised eyebrow. Not exactly, Tom replied. He took a seat on her floral print couch looking around the cozy living room. I've talked to some of the people who've been coming to your house. Jimmy, Lydia, Marcus. They all speak highly of you. Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened. They're good people. They just need a little help, that's all. Tom leaned forward. Eleanor, I get that you're trying to help, but this is risky. Really risky. If the wrong person finds out, you could face serious consequences. So could they? She sighed, her shoulders slumping. I know, Tom. Believe me, I've thought about it. But what am I supposed to do? Turn them away? Close the door on people who need me? You can find other ways to help, Tom said gently. Ways that don't involve people punching each other in your basement. Mrs. Whitmore gave a rueful smile. You make it sound so simple, but it's not. These fights, they've given people hope, a purpose. I can't just take that away. Tom stood, his expression serious. If you won't shut it down, then at least think about scaling it back. Be careful, Eleanor, for your sake and theirs. She nodded slowly. I'll think about it. As Tom left, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control. Mrs. Whitmore's intentions might be good, but the risks were undeniable. And he had a sinking suspicion that things were about to get even more complicated. The Neighborhood Watch's investigation into Mrs. Whitmore's fight club continued, and as they spoke to more participants, a complex web of motivations and emotions began to emerge. Each fighter had a story, and each story painted Mrs. Whitmore in a different light, sometimes as a hero, sometimes as a flawed enabler of risky behavior. Carol met with Jimmy the mailman again, this time sitting down with him at the local diner. Over coffee, he opened up about the struggles that had led him to Mrs. Whitmore's basement. "My mom's been sick for years," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "Her insurance doesn't cover half of what she needs, and I was running out of options. Then one day, Eleanor caught me delivering her mail looking like I hadn't slept in days. She asked me what was wrong, and before I knew it, I was spilling everything." "What did she say?" Carol asked. "She said, 'Jimmy, you're stronger than you think.' She told me about the fight club and said I could make some extra money if I was willing to put in the work. At first, I thought she was crazy, but then I tried it. And you know what? It's helped me more than just financially. It's given me confidence, purpose." Sandra spoke to Lydia in her small, cluttered apartment. Toys were scattered across the floor, and Lydia's toddler tugged at her shirt as they talked. "I know it sounds insane," Lydia admitted, "but those fights have been my outlet. My ex left me with nothing, and I've been trying to hold everything together for my son. Eleanor gave me a way to feel strong again, like I could handle whatever life threw at me." Sandra nodded, feeling a mix of sympathy and unease. "But aren't you worried about getting hurt?" Lydia shrugged. "Of course I am. But Eleanor's careful about matching people up. It's not like we're out there trying to kill each other. And honestly, the money helps. It's not a lot, but it's enough to make a difference." Phil, still skeptical, managed to track down Marcus, the college student. He found him studying at the library, a bruise visible on his cheek. "So, you're telling me you're okay with getting punched in the face for a few bucks?" Phil asked bluntly. Marcus chuckled. "It's not just about the money. I mean, yeah, I needed it at first, for books, rent, all that. But it's more than that now. It's like therapy. I was stressed out all the time, trying to juggle school and work. Fighting in that ring gave me a way to release all that tension. And Eleanor, she's like a coach and a therapist rolled into one. She doesn't just throw you in there and hope for the best. She actually cares." Phil frowned. "You really think what she's doing is right?" Marcus hesitated. "I don't know. But I do know it's helped me." As the group reconvened to share their findings, the mood was somber. Each of them had heard firsthand how much Mrs. Whitmore's fight club meant to its participants, but the ethical and legal implications still weighed heavily. "Everyone we talked to had a reason," Carol said. "It's not just about the money. It's about feeling like they have control over their lives." "That doesn't make it right," Phil countered. "She's still putting people at risk." Sandra nodded reluctantly. "Phil's got a point. Just because it's helping people doesn't mean it's safe or legal." Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a gray area, no doubt about it. But it's not just black and white. Eleanor's intentions seem good, and the people involved clearly benefit in some way. The question is, do we stop her, or do we let it continue?" The room fell silent, each of them grappling with the moral dilemma. Finally, Carol spoke. "Maybe we should talk to Eleanor again. Tell her what we've learned. Maybe she'll see that there are other ways to help." Tom nodded. "It's worth a shot, but if she won't budge, we might not have a choice. We can't let this spiral out of control." As the group dispersed, the weight of their decision loomed over them. Mrs. Whitmore's fight club was more than just a spectacle. It was a lifeline for some, a danger for others, and a moral quandary for everyone involved. And with tensions rising, it was clear that the situation was far from resolved. The neighborhood watch decided to confront Mrs. Whitmore again, this time armed with the stories of the fighters they had spoken to. But when they arrived at her house, it quickly became clear that the situation had evolved in ways none of them had anticipated. Tom knocked on Mrs. Whitmore's door, but instead of her usual warm smile, she greeted them with a wary expression. "Oh, it's you lot again," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "I suppose you're here to tell me to shut things down." "We just want to talk," Tom said, trying to keep his tone calm. "Things are getting bigger than they should." Mrs. Whitmore led them to the kitchen, where the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. But her demeanor was tense. "Bigger how?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of tea. Phil wasted no time. "We know about the new guy, the one throwing money around. He's offering big prizes, isn't he?" Mrs. Whitmore froze, her hand hovering over the sugar bowl. "How do you know about him?" Sandra leaned forward. "People talk, Eleanor. Some of the fighters mentioned a new sponsor. They said he's offering cash prizes for matches." Mrs. Whitmore sighed and sank into a chair. "His name is Vincent. He showed up out of nowhere, said he'd heard about the fights and wanted to invest. At first, I told him no. But, well, the money he's offering could really help some of these folks." "And what does he want in return?" Tom asked. "To raise the stakes," Mrs. Whitmore admitted. "He wants tougher matches, bigger crowds. He's already brought in a couple of fighters from outside the neighborhood. Professionals." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Eleanor, this is exactly what we were afraid of," Tom said. "This is getting out of hand. If the wrong person finds out about this, or if someone gets seriously hurt, you're looking at more than just a slap on the wrist." "I know," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly, "but these people, they need the money, and Vincent's prize pool could change their lives." Phil slammed his hand on the table, making the teacups rattle. "And what happens when someone ends up in the hospital? Or worse, is that worth it?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flashed with defiance. "You think I don't know the risks? I'm doing everything I can to keep it safe, but I can't turn my back on them. Not now." Tom rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. "Eleanor, we get that you're trying to help, but this isn't the way. Vincent's involvement changes everything. You're losing control." That evening, Tom decided to attend one of the fights in secret. He slipped into Mrs. Whitmore's basement through the side door, blending into the small crowd that had gathered. The setup was familiar. The makeshift ring, the betting table, the roaring spectators, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The fighters were bigger, stronger, and clearly more experienced than the neighborhood regulars. As Tom watched, one of the matches turned brutal. A younger fighter, a neighborhood kid who couldn't have been older than 18, was clearly outmatched by one of Vincent's recruits. The blows came hard and fast, and the crowd's cheers turned to uneasy murmurs as the kid stumbled to the mat, blood trickling from his nose. Mrs. Whitmore jumped into the ring, waving her arms. "That's enough!" she shouted, her voice shaking. "This match is over." Vincent, a sharp-dressed man standing near the back of the room, raised an eyebrow. "It's not over until someone taps out, Eleanor. That's how this works." "Not in my basement, it doesn't," she snapped, helping the kid to his feet. "You want a bloodbath? Take it somewhere else." The tension between them was palpable, and Tom could feel the crowd holding its collective breath. Finally, Vincent smirked and raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine. Your house, your rules." But as Tom slipped out into the night, he knew Vincent wasn't backing down. The stakes were rising, and Mrs. Whitmore was losing control of the fight club she'd built. The next morning, the neighborhood watch met again. Tom relayed what he'd seen, his face grim. "This isn't just about Eleanor anymore. Vincent's turning this into something dangerous. We need to act before it's too late." Sandra hesitated. "But what do we do? If we go to the authorities, Eleanor could end up in serious trouble. And if we don't, someone could get hurt, or worse," Phil said. "We can't keep sitting on this." Carol spoke up, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should try talking to Vincent. Make him understand that this isn't what we want in our neighborhood." Tom shook his head. "People like Vincent don't back down that easily. The only way this ends is if we shut it down for good." The group fell silent, each of them grappling with the weight of the decision ahead. The fight club had started as a strange but seemingly harmless secret, a way for neighbors to help one another. But now it was spiraling into something far more dangerous, and the stakes had never been higher. Word of Mrs. Whitmore's underground fight club began to spread through Maplewood Drive, and the once quiet cul-de-sac was suddenly alive with whispers and speculation. Some residents were appalled by the revelation, while others couldn't help but admire the audacity of their sweet, cookie-baking neighbor. The neighborhood quickly split into two camps: those who supported Mrs. Whitmore and those who wanted her operation shut down immediately. Tom, as the de facto leader of the neighborhood watch, found himself caught in the middle. His phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from concerned residents. Carol and Sandra remained cautiously supportive of Mrs. Whitmore, arguing that her intentions were good, even if her methods were questionable. Phil, on the other hand, became more vocal about involving the authorities. "This isn't just a quirky neighborhood secret anymore," Phil said during their latest meeting. "She's working with outsiders, for crying out loud. That Vincent guy is trouble, and we all know it." Carol shook her head. "But shutting it down won't solve anything. What about the people who depend on it? Jimmy, Lydia, Marcus, they'll lose their safety net." Phil crossed his arms. "Their safety net is a bunch of illegal fights in a basement. That's not a solution. It's a disaster waiting to happen." Sandra, ever the peacemaker, tried to calm the tension. "What if we talk to more of the neighbors? See where everyone stands? Maybe we can come up with a compromise." Tom sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This isn't something we can vote on, Sandra. If we don't act soon, someone's going to get hurt. Or worse." That evening, a neighborhood meeting was called in the community center. Nearly every resident of Maplewood Drive showed up, filling the room with a mixture of curiosity, frustration, and tension. Mrs. Whitmore, surprisingly, was in attendance, sitting calmly at the front of the room with her hands folded in her lap. Tom stood at the podium, clearing his throat. "Thank you all for coming. As most of you have heard by now, there's been some unusual activity happening at Mrs. Whitmore's house. We've confirmed that she's been running an underground fight club in her basement." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs and whispers. Mrs. Whitmore rose to her feet, her expression calm but resolute. "Before anyone jumps to conclusions, let me explain. Yes, I've been hosting fights in my basement, but this isn't some criminal enterprise. It's a way to help people in our own neighborhood, get back on their feet." One resident, an older man named Mr. Jenkins, stood up. "Help them how, Eleanor? By letting them beat each other up?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice didn't waver. "By giving them a chance to earn extra money, build their confidence, and connect with others. These fights aren't about violence, they're about resilience." Another voice called out from the back of the room. "What about this Vincent guy? We've heard he's involved now. What's he bringing to the table?" Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, and the room grew quiet. "Vincent's offering prize money," she admitted. "It's true, but I've been clear with him that this isn't about blood sport. I won't allow anyone to get seriously hurt." Phil stood, his tone sharp. "And what happens when you can't control it anymore, Eleanor? You're playing with fire, and you're dragging the rest of us into it." The room erupted into heated debate. Some residents sided with Phil, demanding that the fight club be shut down immediately. Others defended Mrs. Whitmore, arguing that she was doing more good than harm. Tom raised his hands to quiet the room. "Enough, this isn't helping. We need a solution, not a shouting match." One of the fighters, Marcus, stood and addressed the room. "Look, I get that this seems crazy to some of you, but for people like me, this fight club has been a lifeline. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. Mrs. Whitmore has done more for this neighborhood than most of you realize." His words were met with a mixture of applause and disapproval. The room remained divided, and it was clear that no consensus would be reached that night. As the meeting adjourned, Mrs. Whitmore approached Tom with a weary expression. "I know this has caused a lot of trouble," she said quietly, "but I'm not ready to give up on it. Not yet." Tom looked at her, torn between sympathy and frustration. "Eleanor, you're risking everything. Your safety, your reputation, even your freedom. Is it really worth it?" She smiled faintly. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks. But I'll think about what you've said, Tom. I promise." As she walked away, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling further out of control. The neighborhood was divided, and with Vincent's influence growing, the stakes were higher than ever. Despite Mrs. Whitmore's assurances, the tension in Maplewood Drive only grew. Rumors swirled, and the divide in the neighborhood deepened. Tom couldn't help but feel the situation slipping through his fingers. Then came the tipping point. An anonymous tip was sent to the local police, reporting an illegal fight club in the neighborhood. The first signs of trouble appeared late one evening when a patrol car cruised slowly down the cul-de-sac. It wasn't unusual to see police in the area. Maplewood Drive was typically a safe, quiet neighborhood, but the timing was too coincidental. Tom spotted the car from his window and immediately called an emergency meeting of the neighborhood watch. "They're on to her," he said as soon as the group arrived. "I don't know who tipped them off, but the cops are sniffing around." Phil raised an eyebrow. "Good. It's about time someone took this seriously." Carol shot him a glare. "Phil, if they raid her house, she could end up in jail. Do you really want that for Eleanor?" "She made her choices," Phil replied. "This was always going to happen." Sandra, ever the peacemaker, chimed in. "We need to warn her. Maybe she can shut things down before it's too late." Tom nodded. "Agreed. Let's go." When they arrived at Mrs. Whitmore's house, the lights were on, and voices could be heard from the basement. She answered the door with a mixture of surprise and weariness. "Back again," she said, stepping aside to let them in. Tom didn't waste time. "Eleanor, the police are on to you. Someone tipped them off." Mrs. Whitmore's face paled slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Do you know who it was?" "No," Sandra said, "but they've been patrolling the neighborhood. It's only a matter of time before they come knocking." Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly. "I see. Well, I've been expecting this. I'll make sure everything is cleaned up before they get here." Phil snorted. "Cleaned up? You can't just sweep this under the rug, Eleanor. If they find even a hint of what you've been doing, you're finished." Mrs. Whitmore's gaze hardened. "I know the risks, Phil, but I'm not giving up on the people who depend on me." Tom held up a hand. "This isn't the time to argue. You need to shut this down, Eleanor. Tonight." She hesitated, glancing towards the basement door. "There's one last match scheduled," she admitted. "It's a big one. People are expecting it." Carol's eyes widened. "Eleanor, are you serious? You can't go through with it. The cops could show up at any moment." Mrs. Whitmore sighed. "If I cancel, it'll send everyone into a panic. Let me handle this, and then I'll shut it down. For good." Tom shook his head. "You're playing with fire, Eleanor. If this blows up, you'll take the whole neighborhood down with you." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "I understand the risks, Tom, but I've made my decision." That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He kept glancing at the clock, wondering if the police would raid Mrs. Whitmore's house before the fight was over. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a message from Sandra. "They're here." Tom bolted out of bed and looked out his window. Sure enough, 2 patrol cars were parked in front of Mrs. Whitmore's house, their lights flashing silently. Officers were speaking to each other, and one was knocking on the front door. Tom quickly texted the others, "Meet me there." By the time he arrived, Mrs. Whitmore was standing on her porch, calmly speaking to the officers. The basement lights were off, and the house appeared eerily quiet. "Good evening, officers," she said, her tone as sweet as ever. "What brings you here at this hour?" "We've received reports of illegal activity in your home," one officer said. "Do you mind if we take a look around?" Mrs. Whitmore smiled faintly. "Not at all. Feel free to search." The officers entered, and Tom's heart pounded as he waited with the others outside. After what felt like an eternity, the officers re-emerged, looking puzzled. "Everything seems to be in order," one of them said. "Sorry to disturb you, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore nodded graciously. "No trouble at all. Have a good night." As the patrol cars drove away, the group hurried to her side. "What happened?" Tom asked. "Did you really shut it down?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes twinkled with a mixture of mischief and relief. "Let's just say I've had a plan in place for this kind of situation. The basement's been cleared out for hours." Phil crossed his arms. "So what now? Are you really done with this?" Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew serious. "Yes, tonight was the last fight. It's over." Tom studied her face, searching for any hint of deception. Finally, he nodded. "Good, because if this happens again, we won't be able to help you." Mrs. Whitmore sighed. "I understand, Tom. Thank you for everything." As the group walked away, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Mrs. Whitmore might have shut down the fight club for now, but the legacy of her operation and its impact on the neighborhood was far from over. Despite her promise to shut it down, Mrs. Whitmore's basement hosted one last match. A grand finale she claimed was for closure. Word spread quickly, and by the time the event began, her basement was packed with spectators. Fighters from both the neighborhood and outside circles had come, drawn by the promise of high stakes and the opportunity to participate in the infamous final bout. Tom and the rest of the neighborhood watch arrived just as the first match began. Despite their efforts to dissuade her, Mrs. Whitmore insisted that this would be her final act of defiance before dismantling the operation for good. "If this is how it ends," she had said, "I want it to end on my terms." The basement was transformed into a bustling underground arena. The makeshift ring was surrounded by cheering spectators, and a small betting table had been set up in the corner. Mrs. Whitmore stood near the ropes, clipboard in hand, directing the proceedings with an air of authority that was impossible to reconcile with her sweet, grandmotherly demeanor. Tom scanned the room, spotting familiar faces from the neighborhood as well as a handful of strangers, likely Vincent's recruits. The air was electric, charged with the energy of an event that felt both illicit and exhilarating. The matches began, each one more intense than the last. Local fighters like Jimmy and Lydia squared off against outsiders, their determination shining through every punch and dodge. The crowd roared with every blow, the noise echoing off the low basement ceiling. Then came the main event, a showdown between Marcus, the college student who had become a crowd favorite, and one of Vincent's fighters, a hulking man with years of professional experience. The tension in the room was palpable as Mrs. Whitmore stepped into the ring to announce the fight. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying over the din, "tonight's final match is one for the books. 2 fighters, 1 winner. Let's give them a round of applause." The crowd erupted as Marcus and his opponent entered the ring. Marcus looked nervous but determined, his fists clenched tightly as he stared down his towering rival. The fight began with a flurry of punches, Marcus darting around the ring to avoid the larger man's powerful swings. The crowd was on edge, their cheers growing louder with each passing second. Marcus managed to land a few hits, but the professional fighter's experience quickly became apparent. A brutal uppercut sent Marcus sprawling to the mat, and for a moment it seemed like the fight was over. "Stay down, kid," Vincent called from the back of the room, his voice dripping with disdain. But Marcus didn't stay down. He pulled himself to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth, and faced his opponent with renewed determination. The crowd roared in support, and even Tom found himself silently rooting for the underdog. With a burst of energy, Marcus launched a counterattack, landing a series of blows that staggered his opponent. The professional stumbled, and Marcus seized the opportunity, delivering a final punch that sent the larger man crashing to the mat. The basement erupted in cheers as Mrs. Whitmore declared Marcus the winner, raising his hand in victory. For a moment, the atmosphere was triumphant, a celebration of resilience and determination. But the victory was short-lived. Just as the crowd began to disperse, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Panic swept through the room as someone shouted, "Cops!" Mrs. Whitmore sprang into action, directing people toward the basement's hidden exits. "Go! Quickly!" she urged, her voice cutting through the chaos. Tom and the neighborhood watch stayed behind, helping her usher the crowd out. By the time the police arrived, the basement was empty, save for Mrs. Whitmore and her core group of supporters. The officers entered cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the dimly lit space. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we've received reports of illegal activity taking place here." Mrs. Whitmore, ever composed, folded her hands in front of her. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, officer. This is just a quiet gathering of neighbors." The officer's skeptical gaze swept the room, but with no evidence to support the tip, they had no choice but to leave. "We'll be keeping an eye on this place," he warned before departing. As the patrol cars drove away, Mrs. Whitmore let out a long sigh of relief. "Well," she said with a faint smile, "I suppose that's one way to end things." Tom shook his head, a mix of frustration and admiration in his eyes. "Eleanor, you're playing a dangerous game." She nodded. "I know, but tonight was worth it." As the group left Mrs. Whitmore's house, the weight of the evening settled over them. The fight club was officially over, but its impact would linger in the neighborhood for years to come. For better or worse, Mrs. Whitmore had brought her community together in a way no one could have predicted. The following morning, the quiet cul-de-sac of Maplewood Drive seemed unchanged, but beneath the surface, the neighborhood was forever altered. Mrs. Whitmore's fight club, once a closely guarded secret, had left its mark on everyone involved. The police presence the night before served as a wake-up call, and though no arrests were made, it was clear that the operation had come to an end. Tom gathered the neighborhood watch for one final meeting in his living room. The group sat in silence, reflecting on the events of the past weeks. It had started as a bizarre curiosity, a series of strange noises from Mrs. Whitmore's basement, but had spiraled into something far more complex. "She's really done with it," Tom said, breaking the silence. "I spoke to her this morning. She said last night was her way of giving the fighters a proper send-off." Phil snorted. "A proper send-off? You mean a grand finale before the cops haul her off?" "She's not going to get hauled off," Sandra interjected. "The police didn't find anything. And honestly, I think she learned her lesson." Carol nodded. "She's been through enough. So have the fighters. Maybe it's time for us to focus on rebuilding trust in the neighborhood." The group agreed, though the tension lingered. Phil, ever the skeptic, muttered, "Let's just hope she doesn't start something else." Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore quietly began her journey toward redemption. She spent the following weeks reaching out to the fighters who had relied on her. For Jimmy, she organized a neighborhood fundraiser to help cover his mother's medical bills. For Lydia, she connected her with a local support group that provided financial and emotional assistance. And for Marcus, she arranged for a retired boxing coach to mentor him, allowing him to continue training in a safer, more structured environment. Word of Mrs. Whitmore's efforts spread, and slowly the neighborhood began to soften toward her. The same people who had once whispered about her scandalous activities now praised her for stepping up to help those in need. One day, as Tom was walking his dog, he noticed Mrs. Whitmore tending to her garden. She waved him over with a smile. "Tom, it's good to see you. How's the neighborhood watch coming along?" "Quieter without you stirring up trouble," he said with a chuckle. She laughed, wiping dirt from her hands. "I suppose I deserve that, but I wanted to thank you for not turning your back on me, even when things got complicated." Tom nodded. "You made it hard to look the other way, Eleanor, but I have to admit, you brought the neighborhood together in a strange way." Mrs. Whitmore smiled wistfully. "That was never my plan, you know. I just wanted to help people. I didn't realize how much I'd risked until it was too late." Tom leaned against the garden fence. "So, what now? No more underground operations, I hope?" "None," she said firmly, "but I'm not done helping people. I've been talking to some of the neighbors about starting a community center, a place where folks can come together, share resources, and support one another. Legally this time." Tom smiled. "That sounds like a much better plan." Months later, the community center became a reality. Funded by donations from the neighborhood and spearheaded by Mrs. Whitmore, it offered everything from after-school programs to financial literacy workshops. The same people who had once thrown punches in her basement now volunteered their time to help others. The transformation of Maplewood Drive became a local legend. People marveled at how a quiet suburban street had weathered scandal and controversy, only to emerge stronger and more united. And at the center of it all was Mrs. Whitmore, the sweet grandma with a knack for shaking things up. For the neighborhood watch, life returned to its usual routines, but the bonds formed during those chaotic weeks remained. They had faced a moral dilemma together, and though the journey was messy, it ultimately brought them closer as a community. As for Mrs. Whitmore, she remained the same cookie-baking, scarf-knitting, garden-tending woman she had always been. Except now, she was also a symbol of resilience, redemption, and the unexpected power of second chances.